Hello again, everyone. My name is Kassab from GLOBIS, and this is Inside Japan. Today, delighted to have with us Carlo La Porta, who has lived and worked in over 5 countries, very international, kind of global type person, and he's the Business Development Director at LowendalMasaï. So thanks very much, Carlo. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. Can we start off, if you just tell us a bit about your job and the company you work for?
Yes, of course. LowendalMasaï is a consulting group that specializes in cost optimization. So we go into big corporations and help them revisit the way they purchase, what they purchase, how they purchase, in view of helping them make these purchases more efficient.
And has that been your sort of background, your career background to date? Or
most of my career has been in the consulting world.
Okay.
Sales consulting. Yes.
Okay, so next question, obviously I think everyone's dying to know is, what made you choose Japan? I think originally you told me you were born in France from Italian and French parents.
Italian and British.
Italian and British parents, sorry.
Yeah, so what made me choose Japan originally, 1989, decided to take a gap year before going to university in the UK and add something special to my resume in the hope that it would be easier for me to find a job when I graduated from university. And so I ended up coming to Japan for what was originally to be a 6-month language study program. And that transformed into a 6-year study program, and I went to university here in Japan. And I was all ready to go back to Europe. I even had business cards that said so. And I found a job, and I thought, better one I have it than 2 I may have. So I stayed here for a job and basically stayed 15 years the first time.
Wow.
Then I was invited for a job in Hawaii for a year and a half, where I helped with something. And during that time, I was invited back to Japan for a job, and so in total, it's been about 20 years in Japan.
So is that what sort of keeps you here then? You just got all these opportunities being thrown at you, it sounds like.
It's interesting. I've always felt an affinity for Japan since I've been here. Maybe because of my background, whereby I'm half Italian, half British, born in France. I really was nobody's son. So when I was in the UK, I was French. When I was in France, I was Italian. And when I was in Italy, I was British, as far as the people around me were concerned. And to a certain extent, Japan is the first place where I'm kind of quite happy to not be Japanese. And really, interestingly enough, it's the only country I've ever been to where people say, you're like us. Whereas, if I was in France, they say, you're so British. Or if, the UK people say, you're so Italian or French or continental. Even as I suspect it's just a compliment, in spite of that, in Japan, they said, hey, you're like us. And that's one of the affinities I have for the country. I just love the lifestyle too. I mean, you have, in many ways, you have a lot of freedoms. You have a lot of potential. I mean, there's what I call the joker or the gaijin card, which is foreigner in Japanese, that you can play in this society to your advantage, and it gives you a lot of freedom. You can have a lot of fun here.
Could you share with our viewers like an example of, have you used the gaijin card yourself, this joker card, or?
Yeah, I use it very frequently. I think the one example where you can use it, especially in a work environment, is if you speak Japanese and you really try to speak it the Japanese way. The expression is not the right one, but you can't win. But there are times where you can nearly on purpose not do things that I expected of you and play the gaijin card saying, well, I don't know your culture, so I'm going to do it my way. And although they might not like that, they will accept it because they say, well, he's a foreigner, what can we expect after all? So it can allow you a certain number of shortcuts. I mean, for example, something a Japanese person would never do is go and talk to the vice president of a section when he's nowhere close to him, because he's a Japanese person, he's supposed to go through the ranks. Whereas as a consultant, as an outside consultant and a foreigner on top of that, I can happily walk into that office and say, I'm sorry, can I disturb you 5 minutes, and get away with it. So that would be a simplistic example of what you can do as a foreigner here.
Interesting. So in terms of, I mean, you've been in Japan a total of 20 years. Do you have any kind of view of, I mean, 10 years later, 20 years later, in terms of your kind of career path or your aim or goal in life? I mean, what's...
I think that there's both great things about Japan, and there's one thing which I'm not as happy about, and that is that once you've been in Japan for a long time, you tend to be branded Japanese. You have the Japan brand on you, which means that if you want to leave Japan for a different type of job, it becomes much harder because you're so to speak, tainted. That's your specialization. And Japan is, as the Japanese will tell you very frequently, so different that if you've been here for 20 years, people are not too sure that you'll be able to do business in another country in that way. I don't think that's a fair way of seeing things. But that can be the drawback. So where do I see myself 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line? I have no idea, to be honest with you. The likelihood, based on the comments I've just made, are that I'll still be in Japan, but before I went to Hawaii, if you'd have told me 3 months before that I was going to live in Hawaii to work there, I would never have believed you. And if you'd have told me I was going to spend 10 or 15 years in Japan, I would never have believed you 3 months before it happened either. So maybe one of the key things in my life is that there's not so much of a big plan, but kind of grabbing the opportunities as they happen. I'd like to move to Singapore sometime soon, but I'll be quite happy to stay here too.
I mean, a lot of Japanese companies are moving their regional headquarters to Singapore, so there could be all sorts of opportunities as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a friend who's just moved his company to Singapore. So, you know, at risk of sounding like I'm following the crowd, I'm kind of interested. But
the other thing, Carlo, I think, I mean, you know, being here for 20 years, Japan itself has changed during that time. So it's kind of, in some ways, it's a different country than it was 20 years ago.
That it is. I mean, I went through a period about 5 years ago when I was saying, gee, there's so many foreigners here. Because when I first came to Japan, I was very unusual. And I remember that I could stand in a train and people would be gawking at me because they hadn't seen a white boy before. That doesn't happen for the better anymore. So that's all great. From a business perspective, obviously, I think that's one of the interesting points about Japan. It really is a country of contradictions, and in some ways it's changed so much, and in some ways it hasn't changed at all. To a great extent, it depends who you're talking to within a company. But overall, and nevertheless, they have had to, you know, have a much more aggressive take on questioning themselves and how they do things. And so I think at the moment, or for the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years, there's been a lot of change. There's been more open-minded and towards the rest of the world, I think, in terms of, you know, getting new foreigners into Japanese companies, which you find much more frequently now, in terms of the way they do their own procurement, and going outside of Japan, accepting different ways of doing things, and in the way that a lot of companies are now starting to say, you know, English is going to be our main business language. So yes, there is a lot of change.
Put you on the spot here, maybe difficult question to answer, $64,000 question maybe. From your experience, I mean, if you could give any advice or tips to Japanese business people or Japanese companies as they're trying to globalize more and more, what could you say to them, or what do you think they need to do more than anything?
It's very good. It's a hard question to generalize, because are you talking about companies that already have a certain global footprint, or are you talking about the average company that's got $500, $600, $700 million in sales, but not really doing anything outside of Japan yet? And let's, for the sake of the argument, stay with the second group. I think they've got to get out of the paradigm that Japan does it the right way. because they have as a rule of thumb, it really has to be top quality. In other words, things have a tendency to be over-specced. And so there is a big paradigm that has to be changed in that respect, in terms of accepting that not everything needs to be top quality, and that it's not always Japan's way that's the right way, that it has to be taken in a more relative way, relative terms. A good example of that would be there's a company that produces metal shaping casts, and they have this really high quality batch process type of production, which they say is the only way to do that with high quality. And it turns out that it's not, but we had to really push them to go and see another company that did that differently until they could see that it could be done with quality. But be more open and to outside information, probably is the way to summarize that.
So are you optimistic about Japan's future?
That would be the $64 million question. I think that there's my view on Japan is that it's a step-by-step improvement country, and the way to symbolize that is that it before, for a long time they did the same thing, very happy doing what the same thing was, and all of a sudden the Mongols came over and bashed them on the head, and then they realized they had to change, and so they changed, and they went into this new area of growth and so on, and they went into the shogun era, and they had the best swords in the world and a very refined culture and so on and so forth. But all of a sudden they decided, stop, we've got it down perfectly, we're not changing anything. And they didn't change anything for 400 years until Perry came around and bombarded Yokohama, and they said, oh my God, we've got to change. And so, that every time they have to be up against a wall. And then they went into the Meiji era. All of a sudden they became one of the most industrial countries in the world. And then again, oh, we're perfect, no need to change. We're just going to invade the rest of the world now because we're so perfect. And something else got them to change, but it's still a bit sensitive, so we won't mention it. And they changed radically, and they became again, the number 2 country in the world. The problem, in my view, for the last 20 years is that they've been that close to the wall, but they've somehow avoided running into it, and therefore avoided change. And I was hoping that there would be a good side to 311, in as much as it would finally make them do the big changes they need to change. But somehow they seem to be yet succeeding in avoiding that, avoiding the change, keeping the status quos that are holding them back. But at some stage they're going to hit that wall. It's just a question of when. And 2 questions will arise then: is will they be so stuck that it'd be close to impossible to move, or will they be able to do something? They're very resilient. Japan is very resilient when it finally decides to be so. And as they've shown time and again in the past, I think that they will again change and reinvent themselves. I think there's a strong potential for that.
Good, sounds good. Yeah.
I wouldn't know how, but
I wonder what that event could be, the sort of trigger, the external pressure. I wonder what that could be.
Well, there won't be another Perry, and the next big earthquake, I don't know. Because if the next big earthquake happens in Tokyo, as they say is going to happen...
Please don't talk about that.
Yeah, they did say 75% in the next 4 years, I think. Well, then they really are going to have to change it. And to a certain extent, there have been some changes that have happened, with a lot of companies, as you said, moving headquarters away from Tokyo, even sometimes out of Japan. So there's been some change. The problem is how there hasn't been the social change that goes with it. It's just companies have done things on the sly. And what we really need is a alarm bell ringing, we've got to change event.